When you think about the role of First Ladies, what comes to mind? It might be easy to overlook their personal achievements because they can be overshadowed by their spouses. But First Ladies on the continent have their own credentials. Some were doctors, lawyers, teachers, or engineers. Regardless of their academic credentials, many First Ladies use their platforms for the good of their communities. Some are advocates for the eradication of female genital mutilation, reduction of maternal mortality, ending poverty, the fight against HIV/AIDS, among other initiatives. On today's program, we will discuss U.S. First Lady Jill Biden's trip to the continent, but more broadly, we will also take a closer look at how First Ladies use their position to further their vision for a better world. Hello, this is Our Voices, and I am your guest host, Salam Solomon, sitting in for Amina Aliu. With me are my colleagues, Oriani Tangishaka and Semenyish Yokoye. Across the continent, First Ladies are making an impact in their home countries. This is no longer just a ceremonial position. Many of these women are tackling important social and political issues. How do you think the role of the First Lady, or in some cases, First Gentleman, is viewed? Ladies, how are these leaders using their platform for, change?
I think in my view, their position has been and still is ceremonial because I still don't see any defined or constitutionally written role for them. But they are definitely behind very, very impactful projects. And take former Kenya's First Lady, Margaret Kenyatta. She had a project called Beyond Zero, which she used to make sure that no woman dies at birth, and other health issues. And also former Ethiopian First Lady Roman Tesfaye, she made a very impactful work around cancer treatment. So even though they are not mandated by the law, they still use their platform to make to bring impacts among their societies.
Yes, Solomon, that's a good question. I mean, if we look more and more on the work that First Ladies do in the recent years, we have come to see that it is evident that First Ladies' positions should be leveraged much more by the incumbent president. If I give an example there, Monica Gengos in Namibia, where First Lady Jill Biden recently went. She's at the UN level. She is an advocate for UN/AIDS for young girls and adolescent girls for HIV and AIDS. So we see that their work is very important. And in terms of geopolitical issues, they definitely can put pressures here and there. Now, First Lady Jill Biden is drawing attention to the severe drought that has gripped East African nations and has created an unprecedented food insecurity crisis in Kenya. While the crisis in Ethiopia, Somalia, and Sudan are dire as well, Biden used part of her trip to Kenya to highlight a crisis that is on the brink of disaster and to plead for help from other wealthy nations. Our colleague Anita Powell, who is going to be with us today, traveled with her and brings us this report from Lusite, Kenya.
The United States has provided the lion's share of humanitarian aid to East Africa after rains failed here for a third straight year, causing unprecedented hunger that stretches from Somalia to this Maasai village just 3 hours from Kenya's capital, Nairobi. The UN chief for Kenya told VOA that 6 million people are on the brink of extreme hunger this year, and that the situation is exacerbated by the food supply crisis caused by the conflict in Ukraine. But the world's richest nation can't walk this road alone, says First Lady Jill Biden, who this week made a historic visit to the worst drought this area has seen in 7 generations.
The United States is providing 70% of the budget, the money that's coming into this region. But we cannot be the only ones. We need to have other countries join us in this global effort to help these people of the region.
The World Food Programme's Nairobi-based head of advocacy and communication, Brenda Kariuki, told VOA that the need across the East African region, which includes Somalia and Ethiopia, is vast.
We require $6.5 billion in 2023 alone to continue feeding the people that need it. WFP is aiming to reach 45 million people. That is a significant task, and we can't do it on our own. So we look to our donors, our partners, our governments to really step up and make sure no one goes to bed without food.
But as Biden learned as she made a recent visit to the predominantly Maasai village of Lositeti, the needs are greater. Women here told her that the drought has killed their livestock, ruined their livelihoods, and kept their children out of school. U.S. Ambassador to Kenya, Meg Whitman, says the country needs more than a short-term fix.
I would just underscore what Dr. Biden said, is that everyone needs to help as best we can here, because this is going to continue for the foreseeable future, and this is very personal. So,
yeah. And thank you for shining a light on this problem, because without you, the world wouldn't see it. You are the voice. So you're an extension of their voices.
Biden in all spent 90 minutes on the ground. Kariuki says that high-profile visit is important.
The presence of the First Lady of the U.S. in the region, especially at a time when we have a food insecurity crisis, is a significant moment. And I think she brings attention to a challenge that the region will have to address both in the short term, which is with food assistance and ensuring that people are not dying and going to bed hungry every night, but also to bring the attention to the world.
As Biden acknowledged, funding is stretched thin with the earthquakes in Turkey and Syria, the war in Ukraine, and other crises that pull at heartstrings and wallets. But, she added, looking at mothers and grandmothers who had walked from villages within a 40-kilometer radius to meet her and tell their stories, these hungry bellies can't wait. Anita Powell, VOA News, Lositeti, Kenya.
Now we're joined by VOA's White House correspondent Anita Powell in the studio to discuss how U.S. First Lady Jill Biden's travel to Kenya went. And so, Anita, thank you for joining us. It's so great. So you just came back. Welcome back.
Thank you.
And we've seen your great reporting, including the piece we just watched. What stuck with you? What's the story behind the story?
So there are two things that struck me about this whirlwind 5-day trip to Africa. We went to 2 countries in that time, and we were hitting about 3 events a day. It reminds me of the adage about the famous dancing pair, Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, that Ginger Rogers did everything Fred Astaire did, but backwards and in heels. And I think that kind of encapsulates what Jill Biden does on the world stage. She doesn't have, as Lily said, she doesn't have formal power. But she does have a platform and, her own form of a bully pulpit where she can work to change norms. The other thing that just struck with me is how, and she did draw attention to this, how these crises and these disruptions, drought, insecurity, disproportionately do affect women. Mm-hmm. They affect mothers because they are the ones who are, for some reason in every society, charged and often solely charged with the care of children. Mm-hmm, right. Don't know why that is.
Yeah, let's take a closer look at that. So as we saw on your report, First Lady Jill Biden was able to have a closer look at that devastating drought and what it's doing to the woman. We saw that she met with Maasai women and she heard how her children, the children and the livestock are getting hungry. So how impactful is this going to be to the overlooked drought in the Horn of Africa? And also, how do the women feel? Do they feel seen? And how do they hope that this will translate into something tangible that brings solution for them?
So first of all, just to draw a picture of the drought across the Horn of Africa, this is caused in Kenya by rains failing for 3 straight years. And this is also a problem. This problem is extended to Sudan and Ethiopia and also to Somalia, which is possibly the worst situation on the continent right now. We have 3 parts of Somalia that are in danger of going into stage 5, which is famine, which is the F word that we don't like to say.
Right.
So in Kenya, the situation is less dire compared to that. But when you look at Kenya, which is by all accounts a thriving democracy and an emerging middle-income country, this is unprecedented for Kenya. And so we did not see the startling images that I have seen myself on many trips across the continent, in Congo, in Ethiopia, on the Somali border, where you see these stereotypical pictures of children suffering. Mm-hmm. And the point she was trying to make is we shouldn't wait for that. Mm-hmm. Right. That's not acceptable.
Yeah. Did the women feel the same way, that they are seen?
I think so. She spent a good 36 minutes under a tree talking to 7 Maasai women. And instead of asking them, the questions that I think a U.S. official with the Biden White House might ask, she asked them, how do you feel about this? How is this affecting you? She wasn't saying, what are the drivers of this? That's a very 30,000-foot view, which is the view the White House takes of a lot of geopolitical issues. She was saying, how are you managing this? How many of your kids can't go to school now?
Woman.
Right, more connecting with the...
Yeah, just about the social impact of this, which is going to, let's not pretend that doesn't have huge knock-on effects. If we have children out of school, we saw this in this country during the pandemic.
Right.
Children out of school have knock-on effects.
Right. Now, Neda, you've been with her on this particular trip. Now, this is her 6th trip to the continent. Obviously, it's her first trip as First Lady. How different was this trip for her? What pressures might have been there as First Lady, and how different was it?
The pressure is definitely on when you are the spouse of arguably the most powerful person in the free world versus the spouse of the person who's a heartbeat away from the arguably most powerful person in the free world, right? So,
she was the second First Lady.
Correct. Exactly. How it really manifested itself on this trip was, I think, in the security considerations.
Okay.
In 2011, Jill Biden, as the second lady of the United States, was able to go to the Dadaab refugee camp, which is the largest refugee camp in Africa. We know that there have been lots of alerts and warnings and bombings near that camp. For that reason, I think that would have been a place that would have been really good to visit again 12 years later, but you can kind of see that's not possible given the security considerations. So she was in a lot of ways, I think, constrained on this trip in ways that she acknowledged. But of course, she got to meet with the presidents of both countries. And I have to note, she met with the male leaders in private, and one imagines that those were not easy conversations.
Right. Well, Anita, thank you for your on-the-ground reporting. We'll come back and expand on that more. Before we move forward, let's take a look at the Biden speech in Poland to mark the first anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, announcing the First Lady's trip.
The world is also coming together to address the global fallout from President Putin's war. Putin tried to starve the world, blocking the ports in the Black Sea to stop Ukraine from exporting its grain, exacerbating the global food crisis that hit developing nations in Africa especially hard. Instead, the United States and the G7 and partners around the world answered the call with historic commitments to address the crisis and to bolster global food supplies. And this week, my wife, Jill Biden, is traveling to Africa to help bring attention to this critical issue.
And we have in studio our White House correspondent, Anita Powell. So you just heard the president. So is her trip a precursor for, something bigger, U.S. foreign policy? Can it change bilateral relationship with countries on the continent?
I think that's the hope of many U.S. partners on the continent, that it will. It remains to be seen how. I think it's important to emphasize that on this trip, Jill Biden did not have any initiatives that she was able to announce. She doesn't have any scope over, legal change in the United States. That's the president's job, literally. So it remains to be seen, but I think that the goodwill will go a long way. And you can't quantify that. And it's interesting because it's such a contrast from this national security-driven approach that the presidency takes. You can quantify that, and we do quantify that in terms of, literally, lethality. That's how we define our success in national security. But what is the converse of that? Lives saved, lives improved? Why is that seen as lesser? I don't understand that either. Why do we measure in terms of how many people we can kill instead of how many people we can lift up?
Correct. Yeah. Now, Anita, we've seen, several U.S. officials, including Blinken, in the past several months going to the continent. Blinken went to South Africa, Rwanda, DRC, about a few months ago. Now, Jill Biden, of course, just a few days ago. This is a great effort for the U.S. to try to win Africa's heart in a midst of geopolitical pressures from Russia and China coming into the continent. Do you think that Africa is reciprocating in terms of strengthening their relationship with the U.S., or are they still really connected to what China and Russia is doing on the continent?
You know, I think we came across up against some concrete realities the minute we landed in Namibia and also in Kenya. In Namibia, we went directly to a cemetery for the heroes of the revolution that was built by a North Korean company. And then we went directly from there to State House, which was built by the same North Korean company. In Nairobi, when we landed, we were taken straight through to Nairobi on a brand new road that was built by the Chinese government. This underpins the challenge that I think a lot of these African countries have, which is they need roads, they need bridges, they need tunnels, they need all of these literal concrete things that the United States actually, that's not kind of what they do. That's what China does through the Belt and Road Initiative. So it is a push and pull, I think.
And as we were talking, for whatever reason, that isn't what they do. Why is that?
Oh, I mean, the United States has launched an initiative on the back of its Build Back Better program, which is a domestic program. And it's still kind of in its growing phases, I think, is how to say. I mean, the Belt and Road Initiative is 10 years ahead of everybody.
Right.
They just have a head start.
And the U.S. has taken the lion's share when it comes to hunger issues. I think Jill Biden mentioned that when she was connecting with
right, and that is where the U.S. actually does take a center stage role in terms of humanitarian aid. Not just, you know, in Africa, but of course all around the world. It's one of the biggest donors everywhere in the world. That is also not a sustainable model, much like it's probably not a sustainable model for one country to just be providing infrastructure.
Right.
If we could diversify that, I think that might take a little bit of pressure off of every country to provide something in their lane and might empower partner countries to
step up.
Maybe.
Well, we are going to have more conversation on this, but first let's have a break. When we return, we will discuss the role of First Ladies over the years and how, despite not being elected, they have used their platform to push for different causes. Don't forget to share your thoughts on today's topic on our social media platforms. We are on Facebook at VOA Africa. Instagram and Twitter handle is at VOA Our Voices. We are also on WhatsApp, and our number is country code +1 202 503 9025. Stay with us.
From around the world. Let's go.
Welcome back. You're watching Our Voices. We're here in studios with VOA's White House correspondent, Anita Powell. Before we resume the discussion, let's hear what women in Nairobi had to say about Jill Biden's trip and if these trips are effective in our Your Voice segment.
The empowering of young mothers and girls, this one was good. And she even told us, the small chamas that we have here and there, keep bringing 10 shillings, and we put it in our place, and then it becomes our profit after maybe 3 months. This one will help our mothers and even young girls. And also she said of asking these other countries to join hands in bringing those support to these young mothers, because in Kenya we have issues. We don't have jobs for our mothers. Many of us have gone to school, but we don't have works. So if we could have that support, there's just small support. We can even start generating small generating income, things for us to be doing. It will really help us. Thank you.
Farming is a blessing. We appreciate, but we need fruits. We know America, we know other countries, we know them. When they visit a country, we get the fruits, changes, so our people can be more effort to add on that.
It was very good, and this is how to encourage the women to start on their own, to be firm, to say no to abuse, and go and move forward to the development of this country, because we should not discriminate. Because she's a woman, she cannot do this. But she came and showed us. Women, they can do more. Women are capable. Women are understandable. Women should be taken to school to get education, because everything education is the backbone of development.
Yeah, it will really help. Like the one I've talked about, the contribution of 10 shillings. Like for us, we don't normally use 10 shillings to like we save 10 shillings. The 10 shillings is used for buying small things, mandazis, like her coming and talking about chamas, the small contributions. Like it has empowered us a lot. We'll start saving that 10 shillings by the end of the month, starting a small business, starting a small thing. Yeah, it will really help us.
So now, Anita, we said in the beginning that the role of First Ladies is ceremonial and they don't have a power in the government. But we saw how she was received in Namibia, Kenya. It was a warm welcome. And we just heard from people on the continent what they hope would come out of such trips. Do you think this will have an impact on how First Ladies will be perceived and what their role will be like in the future?
I think the answer to that is a qualified maybe. I mean, who knows, right? Like, because
they're qualified. I mean, they're coming from all sorts of backgrounds and have accomplished so much.
I mean, that's going to be subject to a lot of global and attitudinal changes. But here's what a First Lady, and here's what Jill Biden can do, and I think did do. It might be too soon to say this, but a First Lady like Jill Biden can influence norms on the continent. And it's one thing, you know, one of the guests just said women should not be beaten. Yeah, I think that's pretty obvious. That should be, and it's illegal everywhere, and it should be. But you can say that, but you can also take an empathetic, powerful, educated woman out there and inspire other women to say, if she can do that, I can do that too. Mm-hmm. Right. And by doing that, I can build my own voice and stand up to the attitude that women should be beneath men, right? Like, I mean, it's not just telling. I'm not saying that men are the only aggressors here, but it's not just saying men don't beat women. It's also saying women get behind that, you know, empower yourselves as well, and access that.
So probably like a woman does not necessarily have to be elected in the government office, but can still be influential. Yes. Given whatever platform she has, she can still make influence, right?
I mean, you know, the thing is, you talked about universally accepted values, like, you know, not beating a woman.
Or children. Against that too.
Right. And I mean, this is exactly what my follow-up question is about is, you know, First Ladies by default, when they're picking up topics like social issues, you know, eradicating poverty, universally accepted issues, and sometimes soft political issues, they're by default, they're ambassadors for their countries. So when they travel, do they pick up, I don't know if you've come across issues like this, do they take politically sensitive or contentious issues, say for instance if countries are not, or if countries are at odds with each other? What's their role there?
I think that role is largely confined to discussions behind closed doors, and I wish I had been in some of those with the president of Kenya and the president of Namibia. One imagines that, you know, Jill Biden is very read in. She's her husband's closest advisor. Nobody denies that. She's his partner. She's his ride or die. And yeah, there are systemic legal issues that probably do need to be addressed. I don't know if she talked about the Countering Malign Activities in Africa bill that's up in Congress right now. I don't know that, but she almost certainly does know about it. And I don't know if she talked about PEPFAR funding and what Congress is going to do when that runs out.
But I feel like even though they don't necessarily bring it up in a discussion, such, you know, hard issues, But their traveling, their presence there by itself says something. Like Namibia and Kenya are picked because they are democratic, right? That's not how they are perceived.
Right, and also the fact that when you see a first lady anywhere, most of the time in the world, and when they travel, we don't see any protest against them. So they're most likely liked in the places they go to. Do you think, I'm going to allude to the question that I talked about earlier in the show, do you think that incumbent presidents leverage their role enough in order to push for shining light to something, or maybe, you know, putting geopolitical pressure in another way?
I mean, that's a mixed bag because there are 54 countries on the continent. Some do and some don't, right?
Right.
So that's a very big question that we probably don't have the time for today. But yeah, I think
used more.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And if we're talking about outcomes of this trip, by the way, I know as VOA employees we're not allowed to bet, but I would be willing to wager a bet that Monica Gingos will be appearing on a ballot very soon in the future, and that Jill Biden is quite aware of that. Her husband's term ends in 2024, and I think there's only one way to read the support that Jill Biden showed her politically on this whirlwind tour of Namibia, which is that I think Monica Gingos has higher aspirations than being the First Lady of Namibia. I think she wants the job on top.
Yeah, and they were talking about democracies, or you know, very vibrant democracy in the case of Namibia. But I've always wondered, to Orian's point about the geopolitics, but also, you know, when First Ladies travel, as I said earlier, you know, they're by default ambassadors to their citizens, after all, but also by default ambassadors for their countries. And so when you have, say, for instance, in countries where, you know, they don't have maybe democratic systems, or maybe they are politically always on the spotlight, do they get a lot of pressure or attacks from I don't know, I mean, you might have seen cases like that?
The simple answer is we went to Namibia and Kenya where there was not a great likelihood of getting too much pushback. And I think that was strategic. I mean, and I think that was frankly necessary. That like you can't just rock up to a country like Somalia and start, well, you can't do anything in Somalia right now with the security situation.
All right, well, thank you so much, VOA's White House correspondent, Anita Powell. Thank you for bringing us your fresh, on-the-ground reporting and your perspective on the First Lady's trip to Africa. That's our show for this week. Special thanks to Anita Powell